intensities by thinking about the terms absolute versus relative strength. So absolute strength means that it is on a standardized scale where people can be compared to each other. And so if strength goes, and we'll look at strength as an idea of force production from 0 to infinity. This is a scale, right? And we can put different people on this scale. So we could have worker A, who has relatively low force production abilities, and we could have worker B, who is much, much stronger. But we're just comparing these people on a standardized scale, comparing them to each other, comparing them to that standardized scale. Relative, of course, is when we're going to compare a person to their individual maximum, 100%. In the sports and exercise science world, we often talk about, for example, in strength, the 1 repetition maximum. How much force a person can lift one time. So you have your 1 RM for your squat, you have your 1 RM for your bench press. But those people could have very different absolute, let's take that squat RM, repetition maximum. This person has a very low maximal squat, this person has a very high maximal squat. But it's possible for each of them to lift at 50%. And those would be relative to their individual maximums. So absolute versus relative. Now, when we look into a work environment, and we're going to talk about lifting things here for a minute, because lifting is one of the most common physical tasks that occurs in various work settings, and it's one of the most likely to lead to injuries. So we have a lot of data and a lot of information around lifting specifically, but we can really extrapolate this to any force-producing task. If we have 2 workers and one has greater strength than the other, then and they're asked to do the same task, so these two, one is stronger, one is weaker, they're asked to do the same task, then relatively speaking, the person who has a lower fitness is working harder than the person who has the higher fitness. And so this is the problem that we have all the time in work settings, is that oftentimes the work is standardized. That is, the thing we need, the widgets we need moved from here to there is always the same, but the worker is not the same. And so what is harder for one person might be easier for another. But let's look at this in some get into some recommendations and guidelines that are put out by various government agencies. So first of all, if it's something that needs to be done, so again, lifting, occasional lifting. If somebody only needs to lift something heavy once in a while, then what we would like is that the task, the force production for the task, this will be task A, lifting thing A, a force requirement between 0 and infinity. So the requirement to lift this thing is that much. Exactly, you need to produce this much force to lift this box or move that item. That's good, but if we have a worker who is producing, whose maximum is right here, their 1 RM, their maximal force is right there, then the risk of injury is much higher. So from the perspective of making sure we have healthy workers who can continue to work for us and reducing the risks of unnecessary injuries, anytime we have a task A, and we know task A requires that much force, what we want to do is set it so that the person who does the task has the ability to do that much force plus what we call a margin of safety. They're stronger, here's our margin. Their RM, 1 RM is up here. They are stronger than the minimum requirement for the task. That way we will have fewer injuries. And the more often something has to be lifted, the more safety margin we want. So if, for example, here is task B, it is maybe a slightly lighter object or even the same object. Here's our force from 0 to infinity. But now we're in a place where we need to lift this frequently. I want a worker whose strength is at least twice that, but really I'd really like 3 times as high. I want a bigger margin. The more times something has to be lifted, the more margin I want. And if the person is going to have to do this task all day long, and it's going to be a continual task, they're going to have to, do this 3 times a minute for the entire day. I want minimum them to have a strength that is 5 times greater than the tasks to be completed. See, we have to get this way up here. So from 0 to infinity on our force production scale, I need a really big strength margin if I'm going to have to do this all day long. I need them to have much more reserve, here's a key term, reserve capacity. If you're going to have to do something more times, you need more reserve capacity. Here's some examples that are coming from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and with recommendations for strength necessary to do whatever activity it is. And based on those levels of lifting force, they've categorized work into sedentary work. If you have to lift something that's less than 10 pounds, we don't consider that to be that difficult because 10-pound objects are kind of normal in our life. If you're going to carry a grocery bag, it's very easily possibly 10 pounds. So that's sedentary work. And you can see this goes up to heavy work is between 50 and 100 pounds, and very heavy work is anything over 100 pounds. Now think about that. If you were trying to say, okay, I need a worker who can lift a 100-pound object for 8 hours straight, over and over and over, hundreds of times during a day, then you're going to have to find a worker who has a 500-pound lifting capacity to do that job. That may not be as easy to do as you think. It's really very unlikely. You'll find many workers who do that. And so in this case, what we would probably do is as many of these jobs as possible, we find mechanical ways to do those jobs. We get forklifts instead of having a person lift that item. But it could happen that occasionally something very heavy needs to be lifted. And then you can see out here we have if it needs to be done seldom, occasionally, frequently, or constantly. If something, the recommendation is that at any constant work, anywhere in the workforce, if that has to be repeated over and over and over, that we would really like to get those force productions down to 25 pounds. Frequent, like moving, heavy bags or heavy boxes, you'll frequently see that 50 pounds is used as a cutoff. But the reality is, we really have to think about what is it that someone is physically capable of doing? What is it that is safe for a worker to perform? So here's another just way to classify various different tasks, and you can kind of understand that not all jobs are equal in terms of physical demand. Something that we consider arduous labor or arduous work is work that requires above average physical performance, endurance, fitness, or conditioning. The arduous work is typically the kind of work where we say most people cannot do this job. And this would include various tasks like military special forces comes to mind, some of the most extreme like first responder type professions. these are things that most people cannot do, and the physical demands are very high. Risks of injuries are very high. In general, in the workforce, we want to avoid these creating jobs that require this because number one, it's hard to find workers. Number two, it's hard to keep workers. So that means you end up having to pay a lot for them to do that. Let's move down the categories though. So now we have hard work. This is something that where somebody with a near average physical ability should be able to perform it, but it might take a period of conditioning or customization for their body to get used to it. So for example, most people do have the physical ability to work in construction, but most people are also going to be very sore for the first few weeks as their body gets used to it. All sorts of jobs fall into the hard work or hard labor category. Moderate physical work is when you have something that is about near average on physical capacity requirements. And generally, this is with most jobs, it's just a job that has a mix of higher and lower intensities. And so, again, it might take a small period of adjustment, but most people could hold this job if you give them time to adjust to it. And then light work is going to be where, again, there's very little physical demand above normal daily activities. So any person who can do a normal daily activity, going to the grocery store, that kind of thing, they're generally going to be able to complete this level of work. So if we look at the workforce that's out there, there are very few people who have the ability to do these jobs. There are more people who are able, right? So we have a significant number of people who are able, but we have few people who are willing to do these jobs, again, depending on maybe how much you're going to pay them to do it. Here we have where we have many people who are able and many people who are willing. And down here, same thing, many people who are able and many people who are willing. So the hardest jobs to fill are going to be anything that falls into the hard and arduous category. This is where we have real trouble finding workers and keeping them healthy. And we'll be focusing a lot on that kind of work as we go through the course. All right, let me see. One more thing to think about is some of the different factors that affect a person's ability to be in these situations, to lift heavy things or do arduous labor. A lot of times what you will see is that many jobs, people will do them while they're younger, and then as they get older and their physical abilities start to decline, they are no longer able to do the job. Sometimes you see it the other way around, where a job is more attractive to an older worker versus a younger one. When it comes to younger, I'm thinking like working in a Texas oil field, for example. This is a young man's job. There are very few people who have those very physically demanding jobs, past 30. And this is where, when there are very few available workers, the pay is going to have to be high to make this an attractive job. Also, you could look at their experience level and skill level. Construction is a great example of this. When you have somebody who's coming into a construction field and they are less experienced, they often rely on their physical ability to carry heavy things or hold heavy things, and they'll rely on their physical ability, whereas the skilled workers will have worked out tricks, tips, methods, skills that make doing that same task easier and safer. And so sometimes we'll definitely see where somebody's skill level or knowledge level will make up for any lack of physical ability in a particular field. Obviously, we spent a lot of time talking about fitness last time, but remember that there may also be genetic differences, health differences. Even you might be in a setting where you have persons with physical disabilities as part of your workforce, and that is going to affect how they react in different situations that demand physical performances. And then, of course, we have the sex differences between men and women that can play a major role in what types of work each one is capable of, and plays into the whole scenario. So we're going to go ahead and end this here, and good luck on those questions.